AI has the potential to make you rich beyond your wildest dreams or to kill you and every other person you know in an instant. That is, if you believe the current ongoing global debate about this groundbreaking technology. In my view, it's beyond doubt that we stand at a pivotal moment in human history with regards to AI. The debates pitting existential risk against exponential opportunity and those advocating for more open source ideals against more closed models and tighter regulation will have a massive impact on the potential of our species in the future. So, to learn more about this ongoing conversation, I spoke to somebody who is operating right at the forefront of the open source technology world. Joseph Jacks, or JJ, is a founder and general partner at OSS Capital, which is a VC firm dedicated to investing in what they describe as commercial open source companies. As you'll hear, he's very bright, very articulate, and has a very strong belief that the open source world generally, or the open weights world, as he calls it with regards to AI, holds great promise. He also warns very strongly about over-regulation in the AI world. So I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you do too. So here, without further delay, is Joseph Jacks.
Complete dickheads.
I am here with JJ, who is founder and general partner at OSS Capital, the world's first venture capital firm dedicated to backing leading COSS, that's commercial open source startup founders. JJ, thanks so much for joining me. So first of all, I would love to get a brief intro to you, your background, and tell me all about OSS Capital.
Sure. Thank you for the time, Tom. I started OSS Capital in 2018, 5 years ago, and we focus on investing in open source startups. Open source startups are also known as COSS startups. This is an acronym that we coined. COSS stands for Commercial Open Source Software. Basically, similar to SaaS, it's a sort of a type of company, not a type of open source. And basically, we think that open source companies are better for the world. They're more exciting. Products and services where the consumer can trust and not just trust the company, but actually trust the technology because they can verify that the technology is doing what it says it does by virtue of being open source. And we think this creates more capital efficient companies, companies that are just better for the world in general. So we've been investing in lots of infrastructure companies, application companies, many different parts of the software stack. My background prior to that was I started a couple of these open source companies. I was associated with the Kubernetes community pretty early on. Kubernetes is like a distributed systems project that Google released in 2014. And that's pretty much my background. I'm a pretty well-known evangelist for open source and open source company building in general.
Awesome. So I would love to dig a bit deeper into this idea of commercial open source, how it works, and then how what you're doing differs from traditional VC. So you say it's refers to companies, not open source, but like how does that relationship work exactly?
Sure. So the most common analog I would point to would be Red Hat. Red Hat was created in the early 90s and is a business built around this open source technology that a lot of people know of called Linux. And Linux is an operating system for basically running software on servers. It can also run on the desktop, but Linux basically powers pretty much all the servers on the internet that basically give us our data, give us our applications and our consumer experiences, and everything that we click on and touch pretty much runs on a Linux server. So Red Hat was created to basically build products and services around Linux, and they eventually became a very valuable business. And so what we've seen in the last 5 or 10 years is that there's sort of two types of technology companies that sort of choose a sort of design pattern that the company is based on. And this is totally distinct from Web 1, Web 2, Web 3, crypto, AI, right? It transcends all of those different categories or hype cycles or waves, if you will. And so the two types of companies are open core companies versus closed core companies. Red Hat is this open core company. Their core is Linux. Microsoft is a closed core company. Their core is, basically Office and all the, Windows Server and all the core Microsoft products. Microsoft has gradually been becoming and transforming themselves into an open source company. But typically what we see at the earliest stages is a startup founder decides, am I going to start with the open source project and use that as the basis for creating my company? Or am I going to start with an idea and I'm going to write some proprietary software code and offer it up as a service and just charge people to use the software like SaaS, which is what we call closed core versus open core. And so the reason OSS Capital was created is in venture capital, you typically have people who are generalist investors who don't care or have much interest in applying rigor or domain focus in any one particular area or type of company. They're just more interested in like finding the next great founder or investing in any category that could come along. And what we find interesting with OSS Capital is applying an intense amount of focus on this particular type of company and nothing else. But what it's also given us is a lot of freedom and flexibility because commercial open source really transcends and sort of cuts through, like I was saying, all of these categories. And so when AI came along, obviously, it's been around for many decades, but it's been much more recognized as a sort of critical category to make a decision around in the last year in particular. We have open source AI versus closed source AI. In Web 3, when the crypto movement came along, there was a lot of discussion and pretty clear delineation around Web 3 companies that were really truly open versus Web 3 companies that were a lot more closed. And so this distinction really, like I was saying, transcends any of the sort of hype cycles that we've seen come up in the industry over the last maybe decade or so. And for us, it's very clarifying because the reason that open source is a really fundamental thing for the entire technology industry. It's the basis for how all digital technology innovation actually works. All the biggest technology companies would not exist without the pre-existence of open source, permissiveness, and really fundamentally open source projects that came before them. Right, and so that's a big part of our thesis. But how and why we invest doesn't quite differ too much from a traditional VC, because we do invest in companies that we believe can be worth many billions of dollars each over time. We're wrong about that in a lot of instances, as are all VCs. But that's the criteria that we apply. Is like if things go really well and are executed, could this company become really valuable? The other thing that's very similar to VC in general is we purchase minority equity stakes in companies in exchange for some small handful of millions of dollars. And those equity stakes, if the companies actually do end up becoming valuable, could convert $5 million into $500 million or $5 billion if the companies end up becoming really successful.
And so, presumably the risk with COSS is that it's entirely transparent. So it's is it more difficult to kind of have a moat and to kind of protect your position in the market if you're entirely open source? Or am I kind of reading that wrong?
No, I think you're asking the right question. There are some fundamentally different aspects to COSS companies that are quite counterintuitive to reason through on first sort of like glance or first encountering this approach. The first one is, what does defensibility mean? How do you protect your IP? How do you defend your thing? What is the moat? And what I think commercial open source startups do is they shine a light on sort of fundamental reality, which is that the only moat that really actually matters in business, whether or not you're open or closed, is your pace of innovation. So how fast you're delivering innovative things to your customers or your users, and then how you regulate that pace of innovation relative to what you're charging money for. right? And so there's what you give away and what the customer just kind of gets for free, and then what you actually charge the customer to access. And in the digital world, with digital companies, purely digital companies, with I'll leave out hardware companies because things are a little bit different there when you talk about the world of atoms as opposed to the world of bits. So we're just staying in the world of bits here. The world of bits, pretty much every product out there has a free tier, a freemium tier, or something that you get a lot of value before you pay any money. And so there's these two fundamental sort of differentials. One is the rate of improvement and the rate of innovation of the core technology. And then the other is your propensity and ability to retain and continue to collect revenue from paying customers, right? And being able to balance those two things is really fundamental. And so with open source companies, the question of moat and differentiation kind of gets flipped on its head and says, well, there is no IP moat at a fundamental level, and there is also no sort of, in a lot of cases, like a data network effect moat with the core technology anyway. And so the fundamental thing is really how fast and how continuous can you increase the rate of improvement of your core technology, and then balance that with, as you build products and services enabled by that core technology, given that all of your products and services are enabled by this open technology, your pressure for commoditization and also giving away all the things that you charge money for is extremely high, right? Because you have this natural tension of your open source community inevitably might actually want the same things that your customer community, which is companies that pay you money for things, not just use your software, might also want. And it comes into great tension. So my belief is that I don't think moats exist. I think moats are kind of a figment of, of the imagination of the business community and economics and founders and so on. And at the end of the day, the only moat that actually truly fundamentally matters is how fast and how continuous is your rate of innovation and your rate of improvement over a long sustained period of time. The moment you start to see a decay rate in your rate of innovation is the moment that many companies and most companies, once they start to have large user bases, try to become more extractive and squeeze out all of the profits from those communities. That's a very common pattern. There's economists and many books written about this. One example would be The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen. There's plenty of other examples in sort of history that point to this type of phenomenon. So with open source companies, because the core technology is open source, it really magnifies the importance of maintaining a sustained, very high rate of innovation over a long period of time.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I guess it probably, because you're building these communities, allows you to innovate and iterate faster because you've got more people with access to identify problems or identify opportunities.
Yes, it can.
At a
It
much
can.
faster rate.
Yes, it can. But communities tend to not be innovative in the diffusive sense. Innovation tends to come from small groups of people. So there's also a trade-off there. But yeah, to your point, you have more transparency in terms of the feedback mechanisms for how your communities could be benefiting from the software or benefiting from the product and giving you feedback and discovering things that otherwise would be very difficult or cost prohibitive to discover.
Cool. Okay. Well, look, I know we don't have loads of time, so I want to move on to AI and specifically open source AI. So I'll start with OpenAI. Feels like a kind of natural place to start. I don't know whether you've got any views on. I mean, they've obviously very publicly started out being very open and are, some would say, increasingly less so over time. Have you got a take on that kind of that switch and that relationship with Microsoft?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Sam Altman rug pulled pretty much the entire technology community, and Elon, as a co-founder, has explicitly said that as well. And I've been saying that this is like pretty obvious, toxic 180 change behavior from the original mandate the justification and defense for those actions is nonsensical, fear-mongering existentialism, grounded in nothing remotely approximating rationality, in my opinion. But is purely driven by, profit motives and largely a push towards regulatory capture. So that, I guess, after having spent maybe a few months thinking about it, that would probably be the most crisp and concise way I can describe things. OpenAI was literally named by Elon to refer to open source AI. It was literally nonprofit, everything being open source for the good of humanity. And I feel like the decision that Sam made to change the corporate structure and raise a huge amount of capital was both ego, wanting to become godlike with power and have influence over society, and also very capitalistic and sort of profit seeking, which there's nothing wrong with. But when you go from a fully open model to literally the complete inverse of that in every possible way, right? There's like some spectrum that you can apply there that maybe might not be so deeply toxic, and there's plenty of other examples we can talk about if we had more time, which we don't. But that's my general kind of take on it, and independent of the fear mongering and the sort of like irrational references to AI likely being the highest form of risk for humans facing an existential dilemma over the coming years. I think the predominant factors driving the changes that OpenAI made are profit seeking, and the primary lever they're very clearly pushing very hard to switch in favor of that agenda is what's called regulatory capture, where you go to the governments on a global basis, not just the United States and Congress and senators and so on, but global governments, every government leader, and you convince them that your argument is correct, meaning you have sufficient and compelling information to make the case that if this technology were made available to everyone without intensive regulation, it would mean unacceptable risks that could cause existential issues for humanity. And so that's a pretty convincing argument if you believe the premise, which the premise is entirely flawed. And I guess we could talk about that. But if you believe the premise, regulatory capture actually will in fact work. And I think what most people don't quite, the chess moves here aren't 5 levels deep. They're sort of 2 or 3 levels deep. They're really not that complicated. If the regulatory capture agenda does in fact work, which historically it has in many cases in the last 50 years or 60, 70 years of regulatory capture case studies, what will happen is there will be 3 or 4, maybe 5 very heavily funded AI companies that will be allowed at a national level to pursue scaling and distribution of very powerful models. And the implications of that are indistinguishable from, the Catholic Church trying to squelch out Christianity, or things that would have destroyed the propagation of knowledge when the Gutenberg press was just starting to get built. And like there's so many other examples of really critical pivotal moments in the history of humanity that we can sort of like look back on, where this is actually a much bigger kind of potential outcome. The more recent one that I start to refer to more often, as well as many other people kind of with the same views as mine, is the overregulation of nuclear energy, going back to the Second World War and sort of all the implications of that geopolitically and philosophically, going and saying, okay, this is going to be catastrophic. And so in fact, in reality, it ended up being scientifically and empirically based on the last several decades, by far the safest and most efficient form of clean and safe energy, but because of overregulation and fear mongering, held back humanity in making progress in that area by many decades. So what I blurted out last night, which was kind of another one of my, and I appreciate the opportunity to clarify some of these thoughts, because sometimes it's hard when you're kind of running from one thing to the next every day.
Especially on Twitter. It's or X.
Yes, and especially if you're a VC invested in a bunch of companies where you're sort of pulling your hair out every day. The overregulation of nuclear held humanity back by several decades. The overregulation of AI, I believe, can hold humanity back by many centuries. And so the regulatory capture agenda, I think, is probably one of the top 2 or 3 most important pivotal moments where people who really are in the sort of the right mental state need to be campaigning far more aggressively than those who are not. And I'm actually quite encouraged with a lot of the support of people kind of like pointing out that this is a catastrophically harmful thing to be pushing for, not just myself.
Wow. I mean, it's such, I mean, to use your words, it's such a pivotal moment, isn't it, for humanity where we are right now? And I think for lots of people that there are compelling arguments on both sides. Like, I mean, so if we, get into the Doomerism, accelerationism thing, the Doomerists do feel like they make a good logical case often, I think. Like, what's your, so the kind of the existential risk AI doomer take, have you engaged with it much? And if so, how dismissive are you of that point of view?
I will first refer to a quote by John Danforth, who is an economist. And this is the essence of why we're seeing so much magnification of the negative decel anti-AI voices out there. So I actually don't know a ton about John Danforth, but I just know he's an economist. And so the quote is, "The loudest voices we hear are those who advocate conflict and divisiveness." And I think that's just like a fundamental truth. Like when you have something that is very polarizing, the side of the argument that is more in favor of just tearing people apart and kind of creating chaos will likely be the voices that are the loudest, as opposed to the ones that who tend to be on the right side of the spectrum, or correct, a factual side of the spectrum, if we will. More pragmatic sounding. And so it is kind of interesting, the backdrop of that and EAC, which you sort of asked about. EAC is not quite soft and, the opposite of divisive, which is unifying. It is, also somewhat polarizing. But the reason I sort of put that on my Twitter profile and was like, this is something that I really represent is, I think if you went out and surveyed, a great deal, mass fraction of the tech industry, they would, in understanding what this EAC thing really stands for, very concretely place themselves in that philosophical camp, because fundamentally EAC is, it stands for effective accelerationism, which is we want to accelerate progress and we want to encourage as much forward motion, advancement in any area that technology can enable more abundance and productivity and leverage for humanity. And AI is a technology. We've invented this, and I think that's really the fundamental argument. Is EAC stands for optimism, and it stands for giving humans agency and control, and it stands for democratizing access to any new fundamental technology that we discover as humans. And so I think ultimately that's what will likely happen. But the reason this sort of like badge came about is somewhat on the backdrop of the other effective philosophical acronym, which is effective altruism. and EA is its own, I think, fairly nuanced and fractal philosophy, because you've got people who are still very much staunchly EA, at least maybe definitionally distinct from prior EAs, like, for example, the founder of Asana, blanking on his name, Dustin Moskovitz, and then you've got other EAs like Sam Bankman-Fried, who defrauded people out of tens of billions of dollars. And so, unfortunately, given that precedence of EA itself not actually having a strong definitional grounding or consensus, EAC, in building on that in a sort of tongue-in-cheek way, inversely, also somewhat suffers from some of those sort of like definitional cracks, I guess, and that isn't crazy helpful. But anyways, I guess the reason I jumped into this was it's just an easy way to go and say, look, I'm not an anti-AI, Doomerist, decellist, and it's just a cool, fun acronym. Frankly, my view is it's going to go away in the next 6 months, and it's going to be viewed as just kind of like a inconsequential and unnecessary badge, because it'll just, likely propagate into just kind of the default view, like, wait, yeah, shouldn't all human knowledge be accessible, or shouldn't all scientific knowledge be accessible, or, shouldn't the knowledge of how computers work be accessible? I think these things are just going to be, in retrospect, very obvious and accepted, and we won't need to be creating fiefdoms and camps and divisive badges and, political narratives to justify very obviously correct points of view.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned control and agency. I guess their fear would be that humanity would lose control and agency because there would be an intelligence that's smarter than us that wants something different than we do. I mean, what would your response be to those kinds of arguments?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's kind of living in a dream state. I think that while perceptively that could happen, like, for example, when one takes large doses of a psychedelic and you have dissociative phenomena that happen in your brain, I don't think that we can stretch and generalize those arguments to human society and say that we will now all of a sudden somehow in a unifying at a multi-billion human scale sense start to lose control of our agency. I think that these are absolutely insane conclusions to reach. Doing some really creative, innovative things requires some degree of insanity and suspension of disbelief. And so I'm not actually poo-pooing insanity too much there. But I would say that these arguments, I think, are really kind of like hilarious and childish in a lot of ways. And again, you have to really like think and assess what interests do they serve in terms of why and how they are constructed and where they are applied. I think it's really important. A wide swath of the non-economic, so just as one example, from the philosophical lens, a wide swath, or maybe all of, rather, the non-economically incentivized or motivated people who are heavily in the decel, anti-AGI effectively camp are communists or socialists. Okay, so there's like a philosophical connection for you, right? That could be somewhat enlightening, right? If you think about the philosophical groundings. Sure. So the only reason I bring that up is you have a lot of people who are going and saying, well, wait, like the only people who are really in that camp, they want to do that because there's like a lot of money to be made and they want to create the next, $5 trillion company. That's also true, but they are not socialists and communists, right? They want to be worth a lot of money. And so that, at the expense of others or, in the process of creating huge additional wealth inequality. So like, I think that's something I would also point out as far as where the arguments are directed and how they're constructed.
Cool. Well, look, we're running very closely up against time, so I've only got a couple more minutes of your time. I do very quickly just want to ask you about open source AI more generally. Where do you think it's at? How far behind is the open source community running? And like, what are you excited about in the open source AI world at the moment?
I'll talk about two things and then we can wrap. One is what's called open weights, and the other, which is new algorithmic approaches and new models for what you know could come next in the advancements of these AI models. So the first thing, I tweeted about this a bit ago in May actually, and I said there's no such thing as open source AI. And I guess I'll just read this tweet. The reason for that is that open source was invented by a human. It was formerly called free software, but it was invented by this guy named Richard Stallman at MIT in the 80s, explicitly for software source code. And AI, aka neural networks, which is what AI really is, it's neural networks. Neural networks are not software source code. They are unreadable by humans, and they're also not debuggable. Furthermore, the rights of open source also do not translate over to neural networks in any congruent manner. So why is this important to point out? It's important because we're facing the precipice of government regulation, like I was saying. So if quote unquote, OpenAI succeeds at regulating intelligence, the current open source licenses like MIT and Apache that are sloppily, under no better grounds, applied to neural networks, will not stand on defensible legal grounds, basically. So what I propose is we need to standardize as an industry on a new definition, which the Open Source Initiative, I think, paid attention to and has started to incorporate a movement and a sort of consortium of people to kind of talk about this. My partner Heather and I just proposed a definition. So we think consortiums and groups of people that like to discuss things tend to waste a lot of time. So we were just like, look, here's our proposed definition. It's a pretty straightforward definition. So we call it open weights as opposed to open source, because neural networks do not have source code. You have the definition of the model you want to train, but after you've trained the model and put it out there, the weights themselves and the parameters do not encode anything that a human can understand or is debuggable. So what we put out there is a framework towards a definition of open weights, and we think that it's actually more useful, more technically accurate to say open weights AI as opposed to open source AI.
Okay.
The ship may have left the harbor, or the train have left the station, whatever metaphor you want to use at this point, because there's just so much, kind of terminology washing that so many people say open source AI now. It's going to be hard to change the sort of narrative, but there's the link to the post on open weights. The second thing I'll say is pretty much all of the language model advancements we've seen in tools, services, products companies are based on the transformer architecture that was created at Google Brain in 2017 by a bunch of Google Brain people, almost all of which have left and started companies to commercialize this transformer architecture. OpenAI hired one of those people and has invested all of their energy in scaling their models in language around the transformer. I personally believe the transformer is an extremely inefficient, computationally inefficient architecture. It's extremely difficult to control in terms of quality and accuracy, at least in terms of how you want to guide and tune a model, and a bunch of other aspects that other researchers much smarter than I am can articulate better. And so what I believe will happen is there are likely to be many replacements and evolutions of models that maybe take some aspects of the transformer or completely disregard all of them and come up with much more compute efficient and more effective ways at producing language capabilities and generative capabilities in many domains. And I'm really excited about that. I've invested in a couple of things there. But I think in general, the industry will likely head in that direction. And I think we're likely to see a huge change in the way hardware is utilized. But currently, the industry is very heavily invested in this. Transformer is the final destination, and NVIDIA is designing their chips heavily around it. Pretty much every company is just trying to scale transformers. So I think that the future year or two are going to be really interesting to see what comes out as far as transformer alternatives.
Awesome. Well, look, we have run over time, so I will thank you very much for being so generous with your time. It's been incredibly interesting. So yeah, thank you very much for joining me.
Likewise, thank you so much for having me, Tom.